Before we begin tonight's journey through forgotten corners of history, take a moment to get comfortable. If you enjoy these quiet explorations, I'd be grateful if you subscribe to the channel. It helps us bring you more long, calming stories like this one. And if you like, share where in the world you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I always love seeing your answers. Asterisk, the Vietnam War is often remembered for its battles, its politics, its protests, and the haunting images of helicopters and napalm. But beneath the roar of warplanes and the crackle of gunfire, there was another world moving at a slower, steadier pace. This was the world of the rice farmers, the men, women, and children whose daily work in the paddies stretched across the same years that generals planned offensives and governments argued treaties. Vietnam was, and still is, a land defined by rice. The paddies stretched across lowlands and river valleys, their flooded surfaces shimmering under the heat of the sun or reflecting the gray sheets of monsoon rain. For generations, farmers had bent their backs over these fields, planting seedlings one by one, harvesting by hand, and coaxing life from the soil through rhythm and patience. And during the war, while soldiers marched and bombs fell, those same farmers continued, because even in war, the rice had to be planted. The scale of it was immense. By the 1960s, roughly 4/5 of Vietnam's population lived in rural areas, and rice remained the foundation of survival. Each grain represented more than food. It was security, culture, even resistance. Families counted their wealth not in coins, but in baskets of harvested rice. And so, despite the intrusion of tanks and the crisscross of supply routes, the farmers worked on. The daily rhythm of a rice farmer's life was deceptively ordinary, yet also exhausting. Before dawn, as mist clung low over the fields, villagers would step barefoot into the cool water of the paddies. Carrying wooden yokes across their shoulders, they balanced baskets of seedlings, each plant carefully nurtured until it was ready for transplant. The water rose around their calves, sometimes their knees, as they stooped and pressed each stalk into the mud, one after another, row after row, till the green spread across the flooded expanse. Insects whirred, frogs croaked, and the sun slowly climbed. The work was monotonous, but there was comfort in the repetition. Even as distant artillery thudded in the background, the bending and planting went on. For many, there was no choice. To neglect the paddies meant hunger. Anger was as dangerous as any soldier. And yet, war was never far. The same canals that carried irrigation water could also be mined or blocked by advancing forces. The dikes that marked the boundaries of fields might hide traps or patrols. American aircraft, flying overhead on search missions, sometimes dropped bombs on what appeared to be supply routes but were in fact only farmers guiding their buffalo through the mud. For villagers, every day in the fields was a risk, but the risk was one they had lived with for centuries. The struggle between nature, necessity, and danger. The presence of war made small details more significant. Farmers often worked with their ears tuned not only to the cries of birds, but to the faint drone of engines. If a plane was heard, men and women might scatter temporarily, crouching in ditches or beneath palm leaves until the noise faded. Then, just as quietly, they would return to the paddies. Buffaloes pulled wooden plows through the muck, dragging slow furrows while farmers guided them with rope and stick. Children carried bundles of seedlings, helping in tasks their grandparents had done long before them. There were layers of irony everywhere. Soldiers passed through villages asking for rice. Sometimes it was offered willingly, other times under pressure. Both sides of the conflict depended on the harvest, just as the villagers themselves did. Rice became a currency of survival, traded, taxed, or taken. To grow rice was to feed both family and war, willingly or not. But perhaps the most overlooked detail was the silence between sounds. After a bombing raid or a gunfight near the village, there would be hours of stillness. Farmers knew they had to make use of that time. As the smoke cleared, tools were picked up again. The flooded paddies had no patience for politics. As weeds would grow, pests would come, and rice would wither without attention. And so, bent spines straightened for only a moment before bowing again to the water. Life in the paddies was not only about labor. It carried rituals. For transplanting seedlings, some families left small offerings at the edge of the fields: incense, a few grains, a whispered prayer to the spirits of the land and water. These rituals connected the present struggle to an older rhythm of life, reminding farmers that their toil was part of something larger, older than war itself. The work of women was particularly central. While many men were conscripted into armies or militias, women often carried the burden of maintaining the fields. Mothers, with infants strapped to their backs, stooped beside grandmothers whose hands were already knotted by age. They spoke little, the work leaving little energy for words, but their endurance was its own language. In their silence was the persistence that allowed villages to survive. To walk among these fields during the height of the Vietnam War would have been to witness both fragility and resilience. The thin stalks of rice bent easily under rain, but when grown together in masses, they formed a carpet strong enough to feed millions. The farmers too were bent by hardship, but stood collectively against famine. And yet, one must wonder, how did it feel to live in a world where every day was consumed by the same labor, where progress was measured not in victories or defeats, but in inches of green growth, and soldiers counted days in battles, and politicians counted years in negotiations, as farmers counted their lives in harvests? What does it mean, then, that through the smoke of war and the constant hum of conflict, the bending of bodies in the paddies continued without pause? The rhythm of rice farming was not only agricultural, it was also social. In villages scattered across the Mekong Delta and beyond, life was organized around the fields. Families worked side by side. Neighbors lent buffaloes or shared labor. And the entire community followed the cycle of planting, growing, and harvesting. In times of war, when soldiers could appear without warning, this interdependence became even more important. No family could survive in isolation. Communal labor was not a choice, but a necessity. During transplanting season, dozens of villagers might line up in the flooded paddies, moving slowly together across the waterlogged ground. Each hand pushed seedlings into the mud at nearly the same pace, forming even rows that stretched into the horizon. The work was exhausting, yet almost meditative, carried along by shared effort. In those long hours, conversations drifted quietly about the weather, about children, about rumors of soldiers in nearby forests. The presence of war was never absent, but it was absorbed into the daily rhythm, like another season to be endured. Rice paddies themselves were not passive landscapes. They demanded attention to detail. The dikes that held water had to be inspected constantly. A single crack in the earth could drain a field overnight, destroying months of work. During monsoon rains, farmers labored to reinforce the embankments with mud, bamboo, or even woven mats. In the dry season, water had to be channeled in carefully, often lifted bucket by bucket from canals. The task was unending, and during war, it became even harder. Irrigation canals could be bombed, bridges destroyed, and pumps stolen or seized. Yet, the farmers persisted, because, without control of water, there was no rice. Pests and disease offered their own battles, as relentless as any army. Rats, snails, and insects swarmed the fields, and farmers devised countless methods to fight them. Traps were laid along the dikes. Children were sent to chase birds from the paddies. Nights were spent lighting smoky fires to drive away insects. It was tedious, never-ending, and yet crucial. A season's harvest could be cut in half if left unchecked. The war may have been the larger threat, but for many farmers, the immediate worry was whether the next planting would survive long enough to feed the family. Asterisk. American and South Vietnamese forces often considered these same paddies potential hiding places for the Viet Cong. Planes sprayed herbicides like Agent Orange to strip away cover. But those chemicals also seeped into the soil and water. Farmers could do little but adapt. Crops withered, fish in canals died, and yet fields had to be replanted again. Families turned to foraging, growing vegetables in hidden plots, or raising ducks to make up for the losses. Each adaptation was small, but survival depended on them. Despite hardship, the culture of rice farming carried traditions that war could not erase. Festivals after the harvest brought villagers together, even in reduced form. A successful crop was celebrated with offerings at communal houses, prayers to ancestors, and simple feasts where rice wine was shared. In those moments, laughter could be heard again, faint but real. These rituals reminded people that the cycle of life had not been entirely consumed by war. Asterisk. Children, too, played their part. From a young age, they learned how to weed, transplant, and carry loads. War made their responsibilities heavier. Some collected firewood or gathered wild plants when rice was scarce. Others took over their fathers' duties, while older siblings joined militias. For them, childhood was short, measured more in seasons of labor than in years of carefree play. Still, games found their way into the margins of works, mall contests to see who could plant seedlings fastest, or races along the narrow dikes when no soldiers were in sight. Even in war, the instinct to play could not be entirely stifled. The life of the rice farmer was marked by contrasts. Days were filled with sweat, mud, and the endless bending of the body. Nights, however, could be tense and uncertain. Villages might be visited by soldiers from either side, demanding food or shelter. Farmers had to navigate carefully. Giving too much to one group risked punishment from the other. And so rice, the very source of life, became a source of suspicion and danger. Families often buried jars of grain in the earth to hide them, or kept secret caches of dried rice for emergencies. A single mistake could mean not only hunger, but accusations of betrayal. Buffaloes, buffaloes, often called the living tractors of Vietnam, were as essential to the paddies as water itself. Each animal was valued beyond measure, not only for plowing, but for hauling loads of rice at harvest. To lose a buffalo, whether to disease, to theft, or to bombing, was a calamity. Villages sometimes pooled resources to replace lost animals, or shared the labor of surviving ones. In many ways, the fate of the harvest rested on their broad backs. Warplanes could scatter people, but buffaloes had to remain. Trudging steadily through the fields, one overlooked aspect of rice. Farming during the war was the quiet endurance of older generations. Grandparents who could no longer stoop to transplant. Seedlings still played important roles. They watched over children, repaired tools, wove baskets for carrying rice, or guarded dikes when others were in the fields. Their presence preserved continuity. They carried memories of past wars, of French colonial times, of famines and floods. Two younger farmers, their voices were reminders that hardship was not new, and survival had always required patience. The smells and textures of farming life were constant companions. The pungent odor of wet earth mixed with the sharp scent of smoke from cooking fires along the dikes. Mud clung to legs and hands, refusing to wash away completely. The texture of rice husks scraped against fingers during harvest, leaving small cuts. These details rarely made it into history books, yet they defined life more than the dates of battles. To remember the Vietnam War only through strategy and casualties is to overlook the mud that never left the farmer's skin. Rice was also tied to faith. In Buddhist villages, monks sometimes blessed the fields, sprinkling water over the paddies or chanting prayers for fertility. Even when bombs fell nearby, such rituals continued. Faith provided a rhythm that war could not interrupt. The simple act of lighting incense at the field's edge, smoke rising into humid air, gave a sense of order when the world beyond seemed chaotic. For outsiders, it might seem almost impossible that such ordinary routines could coexist with war. And yet, that coexistence was precisely what defined the experience of millions. War was not an event that stopped life. It was a condition woven into daily existence. The rice farmer was not spared, but neither was he erased. His persistence kept entire villages alive. Even when governments far away debated policies that ignored the mud, the weeds, the buffaloes, and the stubborn resilience of those bent over in the paddies. If the war was remembered in headlines and photographs, the rice farmers' world was remembered in silence. They did not write memoirs or appear in broadcasts. Their legacy was not carved into stone memorials, but eaten in bowls of steaming rice, season after season. And perhaps, in its quiet way, this legacy mattered just as much. But still, a question lingers. If rice was both sustenance and target, both life and vulnerability, how did farmers truly feel about their role in feeding a war they never asked for? The rice fields of Vietnam were not just agricultural spaces. They were landscapes of memory, strategy, and survival. In times of war, they became contested ground, used by armies, shaped by bombs, and remembered by villagers long after battles passed. To the farmer, though, they were always first and foremost fields, places where life grew slowly. Day after day, despite everything, harvest was the season when all the labor of the year converged. After months of planting, weeding, and guarding against pests, the fields of green finally turned golden. The air grew heavier with the smell of ripened grain, and villagers prepared for weeks of intense work. Men, women, and children lined the paddies with sickles, cutting stalks by hand, binding them into sheaves, and carrying them to drying grounds. The harvest was exhausting, yet it carried relief. Even during war, to gather rice was to affirm survival for another season. Yet danger followed, even here. Helicopters sometimes circled low, their blades stirring the ripening stalks. Soldiers from both sides often demanded portions of the harvest, and granaries were inspected or raided. Farmers learned to hide rice beneath false floors, in jars buried under houses, or in bamboo thickets near rivers. The work of concealment became as important as the work of cultivation. Survival meant not only producing food, but protecting it from being taken. The geography of the paddies also shaped the war itself. Soldiers moved along the narrow dikes, sometimes fighting directly in the fields. The waterlogged terrain slowed vehicles, but allowed guerrillas to vanish into the green. Farmers often found themselves caught between these forces, their daily work suddenly interrupted by firefights. And when battles ended, the same farmers were left to repair the shattered dikes, replant trampled seedlings, and mourn the buffaloes or family members lost. For many, the emotional toll was heavy. War turned familiar landscapes into sites of trauma. A tree line that once offered shade now carried the memory of gunfire. A canal that watered the fields might conceal wreckage or bodies. Yet farmers had little choice but to keep returning. The rhythm of rice farming demanded persistence, and persistence was a kind of resilience. To step again into the mud after tragedy was an act of quiet defiance. Despite these hardships, rice continued to bind communities together. Meals of plain rice, sometimes with little more than fish sauce or a few vegetables, sustained families. In villages struck by scarcity, neighbors shared small amounts with one another, knowing that to hoard too much risked communal collapse. Weddings, funerals, and festivals all centered on rice dishes, even when portions were modest. To eat rice was to remain connected to centuries of tradition. Even as the present fractured internationally, rice also shaped perceptions of the war. Photographs of farmers bent in flooded fields circulated in newspapers, offering a counterpoint to images of combat. To foreign audiences, they symbolized both innocence and vulnerability. But for the farmers themselves, these moments were simply life as it had always been lived, work that had to be done, regardless of who held power in Saigon, Hanoi, or Washington. The irony of rice as both sustenance and weapon grew sharper as the war dragged on. Military strategies often sought to cut off food supplies, reasoning that without rice, guerrilla fighters would weaken. But such tactics inevitably harmed villagers most. Starvation haunted many rural areas, especially where fields were bombed or sprayed. And yet, the cycle of planting and harvest continued. War destroyed much, but it did not erase the farmer's will to coax food from the soil. The work of rice farming was also deeply tied to time. Days began before dawn and ended after sunset, marked by the steady rising and falling of labor. Seasons dictated life more than politics did. Monsoon rains determined planting schedules. Dry spells threatened seedlings regardless of battles. In this way, farmers lived within a slower, older rhythm than the war around them. Generals measured progress in campaigns in months, but farmers measured it in sprouts and harvests. 1. When the war finally ended in 1975, the legacy of these farmers did not disappear. The land bore scars, bomb craters filled with water, canals clogged with debris, and soil poisoned by chemicals. Yet, farmers returned again and again to plant. Fields once littered with shrapnel slowly sprouted green. The persistence of rice farmers helped heal a nation that had been fractured by decades of conflict. To walk through Vietnam today is to see the echoes of that endurance. In many rural areas, rice paddies stretch as far as the eye can see, just as they did during the war. Farmers bend, transplant, and harvest much as their ancestors did. Modern tools may have arrived in some places, but the essential rhythm remains. What is remarkable is not how much has changed, but how much has endured. The story of rice farming during the Vietnam War is not a tale of glory, victory, or defeat. It is a story of survival through monotony, of endurance through mud, of persistence in the face of forces larger than any one person could control. It is the story of countless unnamed men and women whose work sustained not only themselves, but entire armies, villages, and generations. And so, the unresolved thought lingers in the grand histories of war, where generals and politicians dominate. The narrative: why do we so rarely pause to honor the bent backs, the muddy feet, and the quiet hands that kept life alive? Asterisk, beneath the dense forests northwest of Saigon lay a hidden world few outsiders could imagine. To walk across the ground, there was to see trees, undergrowth, and villages scattered along dusty paths, but just below the surface, carved into the earth by hand, stretched hundreds of kilometers of tunnels. These were the CUG tunnels, a network so vast and intricate that it became both home and fortress, workplace and refuge for thousands of people during the Vietnam War. To understand the scale of daily survival in these tunnels, one must first imagine the soil itself. The earth around CUG was clay-like, dense, and hard during the dry season, yet malleable enough to be dug with simple tools. Villagers used hoes, shovels, and baskets to carve narrow shafts downward, creating passageways barely wide enough for a person to crawl through. The walls held firm, resisting collapse, and the tunnels expanded into chambers, kitchens, storage rooms, sleeping areas, even small hospitals. Life underground was born from necessity. American and South Vietnamese forces controlled much of the surface during the day, patrolling roads and bombing villages suspected of aiding the Viet Cong. For those who resisted. The tunnels offered concealment. At night, guerrillas emerged to launch attacks, then vanished again into the earth. But survival in the tunnels was not only a matter of military strategy, it was a matter of enduring the slow, suffocating demands of underground life. The air inside was heavy and stale. Ventilation shafts, cleverly disguised as termite mounds or hidden among roots, allowed some circulation, but oxygen was always limited. In crowded chambers, the air grew hot and damp. Breathing was labored. Sweat gathered on skin, and lanterns gave off smoke that lingered. For hours or days, men, women, and children lived in this environment, adjusting their bodies to its constraints. Sleep was shallow, conversations hushed, and every cough carried through the close quarters. Food was both essential and scarce. Farmers and villagers above ground supplied rice, cassava, and vegetables, when possible, carried into the tunnels in baskets or hidden in sacks. Underground kitchens had to be carefully designed to avoid detection. Smoke from fires could reveal locations to enemy aircraft, so cooks built chimneys that led smoke through long underground passages, dispersing it far from the actual kitchen. Even then, meals were plain rice with salt, perhaps some dried fish or greens. Eating was not about pleasure, but endurance, a way to keep bodies functioning in the humid darkness. Water presented another challenge. Wells were dug within the tunnels, but often they were shallow and muddy. Buckets had to be carried in, drop by drop, from canals above. In the rainy season, water seeped into the chambers, leaving floors damp and breeding mosquitoes. In the dry season, dust and heat settled thickly. Every season brought discomfort, but the tunnels endured because there was no alternative. The sounds of life underground were muted but constant. Scraping tools, whispered conversations, the drip of water from ceilings, the shuffle of bodies. In narrow corridors, these formed the background of existence. Above ground, explosions might thunder, or aircraft engines might roar. Yet, below, the tunnels muffled the noise. People learned to listen differently, to distinguish vibrations in the earth that hinted at danger. Survival depended on this sensitivity. What made the tunnels remarkable was not only their design, the way they blurred boundaries between ordinary and extraordinary life. Children were born underground. Families gathered in dim chambers to share meals. Fighters rested between missions in spaces barely tall enough to sit upright. Doctors tended to wounds with limited supplies, improvising bandages from cloth, mixing herbs into poultices, and performing surgery by lantern light. The tunnels were at once village, barracks, and lifeline. Daily routines reflected the constant need for caution. Guerrillas might spend the day repairing collapsed sections, reinforcing walls with bamboo, or digging new branches to expand the system. At night, some emerged to lay traps, gather supplies, or communicate with nearby villages. The boundary between day and night blurred underground, where clocks meant little and survival dictated activity. Fear was an unspoken companion. American forces developed tactics to find and destroy the tunnels, sending tunnel rats to crawl inside with flashlights and pistols, or pumping in gas, water, or explosives. For those hiding inside, every vibration, every faint rumble overhead could signal discovery. People learned to sit in silence, not moving, for hours at a time. To live in the tunnels was to live with the awareness that discovery meant death. And yet, within this claustrophobic world, resilience took root. People adapted to darkness, to hunger, to heat, to fear. They carved out routines that made existence bearable. Mothers taught children to remain quiet, inventing whispered games to occupy their time. Fighters shared stories to steady nerves. Before missions, songs were sung softly, rituals performed in secrecy. Even in the depths of the earth, culture persisted. One of the most striking aspects of tunnel life was how it inverted ordinary existence. Above-ground villages were exposed, vulnerable, and often destroyed. Underground, life was hidden, shielded by meters of soil. The tunnels turned Earth into both prison and sanctuary. To outsiders, they seemed alien and unimaginable. To those who lived within them, they became familiar, even ordinary. The smell of damp clay, the feel of rough walls, the press of narrow corridors, these became daily realities, as normal as open sky had once been. The CUG tunnels, then, were not simply a military marvel. They were a testament to the persistence of ordinary people forced into extraordinary circumstances. They reveal how survival often depends not on weapons or battles, but on the ability to adapt, to dig deeper, to endure longer, to find life where none seems possible. But this raises a question. In a world where every breath underground carried weight, and every day demanded vigilance, how did people find the strength to keep going, year after year, without ever knowing when or if life would return to the open air? Asterisk, the tunnels of CUG did not simply exist. They evolved. First, they were modest hideout short stretches of dug earth used during the earlier French colonial wars. But by the height of the Vietnam War, the network had become a subterranean labyrinth stretching more than 250 kilometers, layered with multiple levels. Some passages ran only a few feet below the surface, while others plunged nearly 10 meters deep, forming tiers that could withstand bombardment. The system was not the work of engineers with machines, but of villagers with shovels, baskets, and persistence. Digging was done quietly, mostly at night. Soil had to be carried away in woven baskets, hidden in bomb craters, or spread across fields to avoid detection. Each bucket of earth removed represented hours of labor. The tunnels expanded inch by inch, hand by hand. Villagers joined fighters in this work, blurring the line between civilian and combatant. For many, the act of digging was as important as the act of fighting it, was survival carved directly into the land. Inside, the tunnels were carefully designed to frustrate enemies. Its corridors twisted and turned, creating confusion for intruders. Trapdoors led to false chambers or dead ends. Narrow crawl spaces forced anyone entering to move slowly, vulnerable to ambush. Some passages were so tight that even crawling required twisting the body sideways, shoulders scraping against clay walls. For the people who lived there, this was familiar. For outsiders, it was terrifying. Daily life underground demanded constant adjustment. Clothing was always damp, coated in sweat or mud. Skin infections were common, as were fungal diseases and rashes. Rats thrived in the darkness, scurrying across sleeping bodies or gnawing at stored food. Snakes sometimes slithered into the chambers. Mosquitoes bred in puddles left by rainwater, spreading malaria that weakened entire groups. Yet people endured. They swatted pests, boiled water when possible, and applied herbal remedies to bites and sores. These small acts were not heroic. The smell of the tunnels lingered on everything. Mixture of damp soil, sweat, smoke, and mildew filled the air. Ventilation was limited, and fires for cooking or light added a layer of acrid haze. People carried this smell with them when they emerged at night, a reminder that they belonged to another world beneath the forest floor. For some, the smell became strangely comforting, a sign of safety, of belonging to the underground community. For others, it was suffocating, a weight that pressed constantly on the chest. Hunger was a constant presence. Rice was rationed carefully, each bowl measured against the needs of the group. Cassava, a starchy root, often replaced rice when supplies were low. It filled the stomach, but left people weak over time. Salt was precious, and meals without it tasted bland, even lifeless. When possible, vegetables or wild plants were added, but variety was rare. A piece of dried meat or fish was a luxury. Malnutrition was common, leaving people thin, their faces hollow, their strength diminished. Yet they continued to dig, to fight, to live. Medical care was another daily struggle. Makeshift clinics were carved into larger chambers, where hammocks served as beds and lanterns provided the only light. Supplies were scarce. Bandages were reused, cleaned as best as possible in muddy water. Painkillers were limited, and surgeries were performed with basic tools. Infection was often more dangerous than the original wound. Herbal medicine, passed down through generations, filled the gaps when modern supplies ran out. The doctors and nurses who worked in these conditions faced exhaustion. Yet, their presence meant that survival, however fragile, was possible. Psychological strain was harder to measure. The darkness, the lack of fresh air, the confinement all pressed on the mind as much as the body. Some people developed claustrophobia, unable to stay underground for long periods. Others sank into silence, speaking only when necessary. Time lost its meaning in the tunnels, where day and night blurred into one. For children, this became normal. They learned to play quietly, to whisper instead of shout, to measure their games within narrow spaces. For adults, the adjustment was harder. They remembered open skies, fields, and rivers. The absence of those spaces weighed heavily. Still, resilience found its ways. People created routines to give structure to life underground. Tasks were divided. Some cooked, others repaired tunnels, others guarded entrances. Songs and poems were shared in hushed tones. Small shrines were built in corners where incense smoke mingled with damp air. Celebrations, though subdued, marked the Lunar New Year or harvest season, even when food was scarce. These acts did not change the material conditions of life, but they gave meaning to endurance. Above ground, the war raged. American forces developed tactics specifically to destroy the tunnels, using bulldozers to clear forests, bombing suspected areas, or sending tunnel rats armed with pistols and flashlights into the darkness. For those inside, the threat was constant. They reinforced walls with bamboo, camouflaged entrances with foliage, and built escape routes that led to rivers or forests. The tunnels themselves became weapons, frustrating enemies who could never fully destroy them. For the farmers and villagers who lived in Siuchi, the tunnels were not separate from daily life. They were an extension of it. Work in the paddies continued when possible, and at night, people returned underground. Children learned both farming and tunneling skills, growing up with dual knowledge of surface and subsurface survival. To them, the war was not just above. Their headset was under their feet, woven into every aspect of life. The tunnels also carried a symbolic weight. To live underground was to defy the overwhelming force of modern warfare. Bombs could scorch forests, planes could destroy villages, but the earth itself could be reshaped into shelter. Each meter of tunnel dug was an assertion that survival was possible. Each chamber built was proof that life continued, even when denied light and air. And yet, questions linger. What did it mean to live so long without the open sky? How did people measure time when days and nights blurred into one? How much of themselves did they leave in the damp soil, in the endless labor of digging, crawling, and surviving beneath the world above? Asterisk, by the final years of the Vietnam War, the tunnels of Siuchi had become a legend. They were no longer only a practical system of survival, but a symbol of persistence. To outsiders, they appeared extraordinary, a feat of endurance beyond imagination. To those who lived within them, they were simply life, carried on one day at a time. The harvest season above ground always reminded people of the contrast. In villages where rice fields still stood, families emerged to work under the sun. bending in patties, much like their ancestors had done for centuries. Then, when planes appeared or patrols advanced, they slipped underground once more. The tunnels blurred the distinction between ordinary agriculture and military resistance, between the rhythms of the earth and the interruptions of war. As the network grew, so did its complexity. Sections held meeting rooms large enough for dozens of people, their ceilings supported by wooden beams. Small schools operated underground, where children practiced writing by lantern light. Propaganda was printed in hidden chambers, its sheets carried above at night to circulate through villages. The tunnels were not only shelter, but infrastructure, shadow society beneath the forests. Yet survival was always tenuous. Flooding during the rainy season could submerge passages, forcing people to evacuate or rebuild. Collapses were sudden and deadly, burying workers in clay before others could dig them free. Disease spread easily in cramped quarters, with malaria, dysentery, and respiratory infections, weakening bodies already worn thin by hunger. Each day demanded calculation: how to stretch rations, how to patch walls, how to keep moving when exhaustion pressed down like the earth itself. The fear of discovery was constant. American tunnel rats who entered with pistols and flashlights embodied this threat, those hiding deeper inside. Hearing footsteps above or faint scraping sounds at an entrance sent waves of silence through the chambers. People held their breath, waiting, listening. Sometimes attackers retreated. Other times they set traps or pumped gas into the corridors. To survive, tunnel dwellers built hidden wells, escape hatches, and water-filled trenches designed to block chemical attacks. Ingenuity, more than force, became their defense. What is often overlooked, however, is the emotional labor of those who lived underground. Women carried infants whose cries had to be muffled with cloth to avoid detection. Parents taught children to whisper, to walk softly, to accept hunger without complaint. Elders told stories to keep spirits alive, reminding younger generations that hardship had been endured before, under French rule or during famines. Each story was not only memory, but instruction. Survival depended on patience, silence, and unity. The tunnels also created a different sense of time. Days above ground were measured by sunlight, but underground, people counted hours by the rhythm of tasks. Meals marked the passing of time, as did the rotation of guards at entrances. Seasons were felt not in the sight of changing skies, but in the texture of air, the dampness of monsoons, the dustiness of the dry season. Years stretched in sameness, one blending into another, till the war's progression was known more by rumor than by calendars. Despite hardship, resilience shone through in small details. A child scratching lines into the wall to count days. A cook adjusting chimney vents to release smoke more slowly. A nurse fashioning a splint from bamboo. These acts, unnoticed by history books, kept life possible. The tunnels did not thrive through grand victories, but through thousands of quiet adaptations. By 1975, when the war drew to its close, the CUG tunnels stood as both scar and triumph. Many sections had collapsed, flooded, or been abandoned, yet others remained intact, their passages still echoing with the memory of whispered voices. For those who had lived there, returning to life above ground was both liberation and disorientation. Open skies felt strange after years of ceilings, barely taller than the body. Fresh air seemed overwhelming. The earth no longer pressed so closely, yet its weight lingered in memory today. Parts of the CUG tunnels have been preserved as historical sites. Visitors can crawl through widened sections, guided by electric lights and cleared paths. Tourists, the experience is brief, even entertaining a chance to glimpse what life underground once felt like. But for those who live there, the memory is heavier. It carries the smell of damp clay, the hunger of rationed rice, The silence of waiting in darkness. The tunnels remind us that wars are not only fought on battlefields or in political halls. They are endured in kitchens where smoke must be hidden, in chambers where children learn to whisper, in narrow spaces where every breath is rationed. Wars are remembered in strategies, treaties, and casualty counts. But within the silence of archives and forgotten mailbags lie other fragments of history. The letters that soldiers wrote but never sent, or never delivered during the Vietnam War. These letters carried words that tried to shrink distance, to make the foreign feel familiar, to bridge a world of mud and gunfire with a world of kitchens, schools, and families waiting thousands of miles away. The act of writing was itself an act of survival. Soldiers, whether American draftees or Vietnamese conscripts, reached for pen and paper as often as they reached for their weapons. The letter was not only communication, it was ritual. In the rare hours of stillness, after patrols ended and before dawn returned, men sat on wooden crates, helmet lids, or the ground itself, scribbling lines by candlelight or flashlight. The paper often rested on knees or ammunition boxes. Words spilled unevenly, sometimes interrupted by the distant crack of rifles or the roar of helicopters. Most letters found their way home. American soldiers relied on military mail routes, with letters flown from base camps to ships, then across the Pacific to post offices in cities and towns. Vietnamese fighters used village couriers or underground messengers, often risking their lives to carry notes through contested areas. Families on both sides clutched these letters as proof of life, reading and rereading until the paper softened at the folds. But many letters never arrived. Some were lost when bases were overrun, burned in the chaos of retreat. Others were left behind in pockets of fallen soldiers, later collected into boxes that sat unopened in government offices. Some were intercepted, censored, or deemed too dangerous to pass on. And some simply disappeared into the confusion of war, carried away by water, fire, or chance for the soldiers. The importance of the letter lay not in its safe delivery, but in the act of writing itself. To write was to imagine a return, to construct a bridge back to a world that felt increasingly unreachable. Young men wrote about meals they dreamed of eating, about high school games, about girlfriends waiting in small towns. Vietnamese fighters wrote about rice harvests, about children they had not seen for years, about parents who might never know if their sons were alive. These letters were rarely about strategy or ideology. They were about boredom, longing, and ordinary details. One American private described the mud that coated his boots, another the mosquitoes that left him sleepless. A North Vietnamese conscript noted how his uniform never dried, how rainwater ran into his food tin. These details might have seemed trivial, but they were anchors, grounding the writer in reality when everything else felt uncertain. Paper itself was scarce. Soldiers used whatever they had: official stationery, scraps of cardboard, pages torn from notebooks, even the backs of ration wrappers. Ink blurred in the humidity, sweat smeared words, and rain turned sheets to pulp. Still, the effort continued. Each line was a thread binding the soldier to home, a reminder that he was not yet erased by the war. Censorship was another obstacle. American letters were often read by officers before mailing, redacted if they mentioned troop movements or morale. Vietnamese letters carried risks. Tooth intercepted, they could expose villages or units. Writers learned to avoid certain details, to cloak their words in vagueness. The weather is hot might mean days of combat. I am tired might mean weeks without rest. Families learned to read between the lines, sensing the truths hidden behind simple phrases. The tragedy lay in the silence when letters stopped, arriving 4 families each day without news, stretched into fear. Was the letter delayed, or had the writer fallen? The absence of words became its own message, heavy with uncertainty. Some families waited months, only to receive official notices of death. Others never received confirmation, living in the limbo of not knowing. Those undelivered letters remain fragments of untold histories, found years later in trunks, archives, or battlefields. They speak in voices that history almost forgot. They reveal not the strategies of generals, but the hearts of men who longed for their families, their homes, their ordinary lives. They remind us that beneath every uniform was someone who missed the smell of home-cooked meals, the laughter of siblings, the comfort of familiar streets. And so, one wonders if these letters had reached their destinations, if their words had been read at kitchen tables or in village courtyards. How might the memory of the war itself feel different today? The journey of a letter during the Vietnam War was as perilous as that of any soldier. To imagine its path is to see a fragile piece of paper passing through jungles, checkpoints, bases, and skies filled with fire. Each stage carried the risk of loss, delay, or destruction for American soldiers. Mail was often the most anticipated event of the day. Supply helicopters that brought ammunition and rations also carried sacks of envelopes. When the mailbags were opened, men crowded around, hoping for their names to be called. A letter could transform an entire week, lifting spirits more than any ration or rest. To be left without one, while others read their news aloud or quietly to themselves, was to feel isolation deepen. And yet, just as letters arrived, they could also vanish. Combat zones were unpredictable. Bags were left behind in retreats, destroyed in ambushes, or lost in flooded rivers. For Vietnamese fighters, especially those aligned with the North, letters traveled by hand through intricate courier systems. Messengers, often young women or older men less likely to attract attention, carried folded sheets tucked into clothing or hidden among goods. They walked narrow trails, waded through rivers, and navigated checkpoints, risking capture at every step. Sometimes, letters were memorized word for word, then destroyed, with the message delivered orally when the courier reached the village. Even so, many messages never arrived. Couriers were caught, killed, or forced to abandon their loads. Content of these letters, when preserved, reveals striking similarities across the divide. American draftees and North Vietnamese conscripts alike wrote about weather, about food, about the small discomforts that became constant companions. A poet described endless rain that turned uniforms into rags, mosquitoes that feasted without mercy, boots that never dried. They wrote of exhaustion more than combat, of boredom punctuated by fear. Ideology, the cause for which they fought, appeared only faintly. The letters were less about nations and more about mothers, wives, siblings, and the ache of distance. But not all letters were permitted to speak freely. Censorship filtered words, trimming away despair or anger. American military censors blacked outlines that hinted at low morale. Vietnamese fighters often self-censored, avoiding details that could endanger families if intercepted. Still, traces of hidden truths lingered between the lines. A soldier who wrote, "I am healthy," 3 times might be signaling otherwise. A sudden change in handwriting could betray wounds or illness. Families became skilled in deciphering these quiet codes, reading not only the words, but the silences that surrounded them. Some letters never reached their recipients because they were deliberately withheld. Governments sometimes intercepted correspondence, fearing the impact on morale. American officials worried about letters that described disillusionment or atrocities. In the North, letters that revealed hardship could be judged as weakening the cause. And so, words meant for mothers or children were instead locked away in files, where they gathered dust for decades. The physical fragility of the letters mirrored the fragility of life in war. Paper absorbed sweat, tore easily and blurred under rain. Ink faded in the humidity. Soldiers protected letters by folding them into plastic, tucking them into helmets, or carrying them in breast pockets close to the heart. Some letters were found later, stained with mud or blood, pressed against bodies on the battlefield. For families, these fragments became relics, more personal and sacred than any medal. The importance of these words cannot be overstated. 4. Wars are remembered in strategies, treaties, and casualty counts. But within the silence of archives and forgotten mailbags lie other fragments of history. The letters that soldiers wrote but never sent, or never delivered during the Vietnam War. These letters carried words that tried to shrink distance, to make the foreign feel familiar, to bridge a world of mud and gunfire with a world of kitchens, schools, and families waiting thousands of miles away. The act of writing was itself an act of survival. Soldiers, whether American draftees or Vietnamese conscripts, reached for pen and paper as often as they reached for their weapons. The letter was not only communication, it was ritual. In the rare hours of stillness, after patrols ended and before dawn returned, men sat on wooden crates, helmet lids, or the ground itself, scribbling lines by candlelight or flashlight. The paper often rested on knees or ammunition boxes. Words spilled unevenly, sometimes interrupted by the distant crack of rifles or the roar of helicopters. Most letters found their way home. American soldiers relied on military mail routes, with letters flown from base camps to ships, then across the Pacific to post offices in cities and towns. Vietnamese fighters used village couriers or underground messengers, often risking their lives to carry notes through contested areas. Families on both sides clutched these letters as proof of life, reading and rereading until the paper softened at the folds. But many letters never arrived. Some were lost when bases were overrun, burned in the chaos of retreat. Others were left behind in pockets of fallen soldiers, later collected into boxes that sat unopened in government offices. Some were intercepted, censored, or deemed too dangerous to pass on. And some simply disappeared into the confusion of war, carried away by water, fire, or chance for the soldiers. The importance of the letter lay not in its safe delivery, but in the act of writing itself. To write was to imagine a return, to construct a bridge back to a world that felt increasingly unreachable. Young men wrote about meals they dreamed of eating, about high school games, about girlfriends waiting in small towns. Vietnamese fighters wrote about rice harvests, about children they had not seen for years, about parents who might never know if their sons were alive. These letters were rarely about strategy or ideology. They were about boredom, longing, and ordinary details. One American private described the mud that coated his boots, another the mosquitoes that left him sleepless. A North Vietnamese conscript noted how his uniform never dried, how rainwater ran into his food tin. These details might have seemed trivial, but they were anchors, grounding the writer in reality when everything else felt uncertain. Paper itself was scarce. Soldiers used whatever they had: official stationery, scraps of cardboard, pages torn from notebooks, even the backs of ration wrappers. Ink blurred in the humidity, sweat smeared words, and rain turned sheets to pulp. Still, the effort continued. Each line was a thread binding the soldier to home, a reminder that he was not yet erased by the war. Censorship was another obstacle. American letters were often read by officers before mailing, redacted if they mentioned troop movements or morale. Vietnamese letters carried risks. Tooth intercepted, they could expose villages or units. Writers learned to avoid certain details, to cloak their words in vagueness. The weather is hot might mean days of combat. I am tired might mean weeks without rest. Families learned to read between the lines, sensing the truths hidden behind simple phrases. The tragedy lay in the silence when letters stopped arriving, 4 families each day without news stretched into fear. Was the letter delayed, or had the writer fallen? The absence of words became its own message, heavy with uncertainty. Some families waited months, only to receive official notices of death. Others never received confirmation, living in the limbo of not knowing. Those undelivered letters remain fragments of untold histories, found years later in trunks, archives, or battlefields. They speak in voices that history almost forgot. They reveal not the strategies of generals, but the hearts of men who longed for their families, their homes, their ordinary lives. They remind us that beneath every uniform was someone who missed the smell of home-cooked meals, the laughter of siblings, the comfort of familiar streets. And so, one wonders if these letters had reached their destinations, if their words had been read at kitchen tables or in village courtyards. How might the memory of the war itself feel different today? The journey of a letter during the Vietnam War was as perilous as that of any soldier. To imagine its path is to see a fragile piece of paper passing through jungles, checkpoints, bases, and skies filled with fire. Each stage carried the risk of loss, delay, or destruction for American soldiers. Mail was often the most anticipated event of the day. Supply helicopters that brought ammunition and rations also carried sacks of envelopes. When the mailbags were opened, men crowded around, hoping for their names to be called. A letter could transform an entire week, lifting spirits more than any ration or rest. To be left without one, while others read their news aloud or quietly to themselves, was to feel isolation deepen. And yet, just as letters arrived, they could also vanish. Combat zones were unpredictable. Bags were left behind in retreats, destroyed in ambushes, or lost in flooded rivers. For Vietnamese fighters, especially those aligned with the North, letters traveled by hand through intricate courier systems. Messengers, often young women or older men less likely to attract attention, carried folded sheets tucked into clothing or hidden among goods. They walked narrow trails, waded through rivers, and navigated checkpoints, risking capture at every step. Sometimes, letters were memorized word for word, then destroyed, with the message delivered orally when the courier reached the village. Even so, many messages never arrived. Couriers were caught, killed, or forced to abandon their loads. Content of these letters, when preserved, reveals striking similarities across the divide. American draftees and North Vietnamese conscripts alike wrote about weather, about food, about the small discomforts that became constant companions. A poet described endless rain that turned uniforms into rags, mosquitoes that feasted without mercy, boots that never dried. They wrote of exhaustion more than combat, of boredom punctuated by fear. Ideology, the cause for which they fought, appeared only faintly. The letters were less about nations and more about mothers, wives, siblings, and the ache of distance. But not all letters were permitted to speak freely. Censorship filtered words, trimming away despair or anger. American military censors blacked outlines that hinted at low morale. Vietnamese fighters often self-censored, avoiding details that could endanger families if intercepted. Still, traces of hidden truths lingered between the lines. A soldier who wrote, "I am healthy," 3 times might be signaling otherwise. A sudden change in handwriting could betray wounds or illness. Families became skilled in deciphering these quiet codes, reading not only the words, but the silences that surrounded them. Some letters never reached their recipients because they were deliberately withheld. Governments sometimes intercepted correspondence, fearing the impact on morale. American officials worried about letters that described disillusionment or atrocities. In the North, letters that revealed hardship could be judged as weakening the cause. And so, Words meant for mothers or children were instead locked away in files where they gathered dust for decades. The physical fragility of the letters mirrored the fragility of life in war. Paper absorbed sweat, tore easily, and blurred under. Rain ink faded in the humidity. Soldiers protected letters by folding them into plastic, tucking them into helmets, or carrying them in breast pockets close to the heart. Some letters were found later, stained with mud or blood, pressed against bodies on the battlefield. For families, these fragments became relics, more personal and sacred than any medal. The importance of these words cannot be overstated. For the writer, the act of shaping sentences was a way of remembering who they were beyond the uniform. For the reader, the arrival of a letter was proof that a loved one still existed in the chaos. Even when delayed by months, letters offered comfort, anchoring families to the belief that reunion was still possible. Yet what happens when the letter never arrives? The silence became its own wound. Families in America checked mailboxes with growing dread. Families in Vietnam waited for messengers who never came. Some carried hope for years, long after the war ended, imagining that lost letters might still appear. Occasionally, they did. Decades later, unopened bundles were discovered in warehouses, attics, or forgotten postal bags. When finally delivered, the words arrived like ghost voices from the past, speaking to readers who had grown old waiting. One collection found in the United States contained hundreds of unsent letters written by draftees who never returned. Their words described small details: the smell of rain, the taste of rations, the sound of insects at night. They asked about birthdays, about new babies, about whether the family dog still slept on the porch. These simple, almost mundane lines became devastating in retrospect. They showed not soldiers in battle, but young men trying to remain human in the face of inhuman circumstances. To stand along the trail in those years would have been to see an endless procession lines of bicycles, sometimes hundreds in a row, guided by silent figures whose faces were illuminated only by moonlight. They moved like shadows, vanishing into the jungle at the sound of aircraft re-emerging when silence returned. Their labor left few monuments, yet it carried armies, sustained villages, and resisted one of the most powerful militaries in the world. But one question remains: what did it feel like to be a young porter, pushing a bicycle day after day, knowing that each step was both a burden and a contribution to a cause larger than oneself? The bicycle convoys along the Ho Chi Minh Trail were more than logistics. They were lifelines that threaded through the jungle like veins through a body. Without them, the war could not have been sustained. Yet, to understand their significance, one must look closely at the lives of the porters, the conditions of the trail, the sheer determination required to keep supplies flowing. The porters who pushed bicycles were often villagers from rural provinces, young men barely out of their teens, and in many cases, women as well. Drafted not into combat, but into supply duty, they left behind families, farms, and familiar rhythms of daily life. Some were farmers who traded rice fields for jungle paths. Others were students who set aside books to learn the art of loading and balancing cargo. Their work was rarely celebrated, yet without it, the front lines would have collapsed. A typical load could weigh 200 to 300 kilograms, strapped tightly onto the frame with bamboo poles, ropes, and cloth. Rice, salt, medical supplies, and ammunition made up the bulk. Once loaded, the bicycles could not be ridden. They became carts, guided slowly by pushing and pulling. Porters leaned their weight into the handlebars, backs bent, muscles straining. Progress was painfully slow, sometimes no more than 20 kilometers a day through the thick jungle. But distance mattered less than persistence. Every sack delivered meant more days of survival for those waiting at the front. The trail itself was never a single road. It was a shifting network of paths, continually rerouted as bombing raids destroyed sections. Porters learned to adapt quickly. When craters blocked the way, they built detours through forest. When bridges collapsed, they improvised crossings using bamboo poles or lashed together logs. Entire convoys could disappear into dense foliage at the first sign of aircraft, waiting hours in silence before continuing. The jungle was both ally and enemy. It concealed, but it also exhausted. Silence was a discipline. Porters wrapped parts of the bicycles in cloth to prevent rattling, cushioned metal against metal, and learned to tread softly. Even conversation was limited to whispers. At night, movement became almost spectral. Long lines of bicycles slipped quietly under the canopy, guided only by faint moonlight or memory. The forest itself seemed to listen, each sound magnified by fear of detection. Rest was rare. Porters stopped only briefly to eat or sleep, often curling beside their bicycles for a few hours before moving again. Meals were simple: handfuls of rice, cassava, or dried vegetables carried in small bundles. Water came from streams, boiled when possible, but often drunk as it was. Disease spread easily: malaria, dysentery, and exhaustion weakened bodies already thin from hunger. Many porters carried small charms or amulets from families, leaving them to protect against both bullets and illness. Mechanics played a crucial role in keeping bicycles functional. Along the trail, hidden workshops repaired frames, replaced spokes, and carved wooden wheels when rubber tires wore out. Bamboo, abundant in the jungle, became a versatile resource used for reinforcing frames, placing parts, or crafting sleds to drag bicycles across impossible terrain. The ingenuity of these adaptations turned the humble bicycle into a machine of war, more durable in the jungle than trucks or jeeps could ever be. The physical effort of pushing such loads was immense, but the psychological strain was just as heavy. Porters lived with the constant awareness that discovery meant destruction. Bombing runs targeted the trail relentlessly, clearing paths and scattering convoys. Sometimes, porters pushed bicycles past the smoking wreckage of comrades who had been caught in an earlier strike. Fear was constant, but the work demanded focus. Each step forward meant another chance for supplies to reach their destination. Despite the hardship, a quiet camaraderie developed among porters. Teams worked together to push bicycles up steep slopes, their bodies straining in unison. When illness struck one, others shared loads, redistributing weight so no one was left behind. Songs were sometimes whispered at night, soft enough to blend with the rustle of leaves, giving rhythm to the march. These moments of solidarity became a counterweight to the loneliness of the trail. The importance of the bicycle convoys also reveals something about the nature of the war itself. The conflict was not fought only with technology and firepower, but with persistence and endurance. Copters, jets, and tanks dominated headlines, but it was the slow, steady push of bicycles that kept armies supplied. The contrast is striking. Machines of steel costing millions of dollars, countered by bicycles reinforced with bamboo. Yet the latter proved just as decisive in sustaining the war effort. The porter's anonymity is perhaps the most telling detail. Unlike generals or famous battles, their names rarely appear in histories. Yet every sack of rice, every box of ammunition, every bundle of medicine delivered by bicycle became part of the fabric of the war. Their contribution was quiet, but without it, strategies would have faltered. In this sense, the war was carried as much by the creak of wheels and the strain of hands on handlebars as by gunfire or politics. And so, one must ask, what did it mean for these young men and women to measure their days not in victories or defeats, but in kilometers pushed in, loads delivered, and knights survived. Did they know that history would largely forget them, even as their effort shaped the course of the war? Asterisks, by the final years of the Vietnam War, the image of the loaded bicycle had become more than a practical sight along jungle trails. It had become a quiet symbol of endurance. When the history of the conflict is recalled, attention often rests on helicopters, artillery, or foreign strategies. Yet beneath those narratives ran the unbroken rhythm of bicycle wheels and the steady footsteps of porters pushing loads through mud, dust, and silence. The scale of this effort is difficult to grasp. Historians estimate that during the peak years of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, hundreds of thousands of bicycles moved supplies southward. They did so not in isolation, but as part of a constant flow, porters following one another across mountains, through rivers, past bomb craters. Each bicycle was a thread, and together they wove the fabric of the supply chain. Without them, the ability to sustain long campaigns would have collapsed. The physical strain never lessened. A load of 200 to 300 kilograms tested the limits of both machine and human body. Shoulders ached from pushing, hands blistered from gripping handlebars wrapped in rope, legs trembled from guiding bicycles up steep inclines. In the rainy season, mud clung thick to wheels until they could hardly turn. In the dry season, dust rose in choking clouds, coating skin and lungs. Yet porters pressed forward, driven less by ideology than by necessity. To falter meant hunger at the front lines, defeat in the larger struggle. The ingenuity behind these bicycles continued to evolve. Some were fitted with bamboo yokes that allowed porters to harness themselves to the load, pulling as well as pushing. Others had widened wheels crafted from strips of wood to handle mud. Ropes tied to handlebars allowed better leverage, letting porters steer while walking beside the bicycles. These modifications were not the work of factories, but of villagers, mechanics, and blacksmiths improvising with whatever materials were available. Each innovation made survival slightly more possible. Bombing raids remained the greatest danger. The United States devoted enormous resources to cutting the trail, dropping millions of tons of explosives in an attempt to sever supply lines. Craters scarred the land, forcing detours that added days to already grueling journeys. Bridges rebuilt one day were destroyed the next. Yet the bicycle convoys adapted. Porters learned to travel at night, to disperse during the day, to camouflage loads beneath leaves and grass. Silence and patience became as vital as strength. The human stories within these convoys revealed the true weight of their work. Some porters were as young as 16, leaving behind families who depended on their labor in the fields. Others were middle-aged farmers who had traded plows for bicycles. Many were women, balancing the double burden of supply, work, and care for children left behind in villages. Their names are rarely recorded, but their sweat and endurance carried the war forward. Rest moments were precious. At hidden camps along the trail, porters paused to mend bicycles, boil rice, and wash in streams. Laughter sometimes returned, brief and fragile, as comrades shared stories. The war's end in 1975 brought relief, but it also left scars. Many bicycles remained abandoned along trails, their frames rusting under the jungle canopy. Others were repurposed, returning to villages as tools of farming life once again. For former porters, the memory of pushing those bicycles through the night never faded. Their bodies bore the marks of strained scars from rope burns, weakened lungs from dust and smoke, backs bent by years of labor. Yet few spoke of it. Their role was considered ordinary, too mundane compared to the drama of battles in later years. When historians and visitors retraced the Ho Chi Minh Trail, bicycles were sometimes displayed in museums, loaded with sacks of rice or wooden boxes. They stood as reminders of how a simple machine became one of the most decisive tools of the war. Tourists marveled at the weight they had carried, at the ingenuity of their modifications. But for those who once pushed them, these bicycles were not curiosities. They were memories of exhaustion, fear, and survival. The story of the bicycles is not about triumph in the conventional sense. It is about persistence, the quiet, grinding work that sustains life in the midst of destruction. Which shows how wars are not only won or lost in battles, but in the invisible labor of those who move food, water, and ammunition step by step through impossible terrain. It reveals that history is carried not only by generals, but by hands gripping handlebars, by feet pressing into muddy paths, by wheels turning slowly in the night. And so the reflection lingers. When we think of wars, do we remember only the weapons and the battles, or do we also honor the bicycles, the porters, and the unseen endurance that made everything else possible? Asterisk, amid the roar of helicopters, the thunder of artillery, and the silence that followed battles, there existed another, rhythm softer, quieter, but no less relentless. It was the rhythm of nurses working through the long nights of the Vietnam War. Their names rarely appear in official histories, overshadowed by generals and strategies, but their presence shaped survival in ways both immediate and enduring. Nursing during the Vietnam War was unlike anything found in textbooks or training wards. Conditions were harsh, unpredictable, and often improvisational. For American nurses stationed in field hospitals, as well as Vietnamese nurses tending to villagers and fighters. The work began before dawn and ended long after midnight, if it ended at all. Every day was defined not by schedules, but by the arrival of casualties. A field hospital was never silent. Canvas tents or hastily built structures buzzed with generators powering dim lights. The smell of antiseptic mingled with blood, sweat, and dust carried in from the battlefield. Outside, helicopters landed with a constant whir, their stretchers unloaded quickly by medics. Inside, nurses prepared cots, organized supplies, and readied themselves for waves of wounded that could arrive at any moment. The work was physically exhausting. Nurses moved constantly lifting patients, carrying equipment, cleaning wounds, and preparing surgeries. They endured the same heat and humidity as soldiers, their uniforms damp with sweat. Sleep came in short bursts, stolen when patients stabilized. Meals were hurried, often eaten standing, interrupted by calls for assistance. The body adjusted to fatigue until fatigue itself became normal. Yet, the true weight of nursing lay not in the physical strain, but in the emotional burden. Every nurse confronted suffering on a scale that few could imagine. Young men with wounds from mines or bullets, villagers burned by napalm, children injured by stray artillery, all passed through their hands. Some could be saved, others could not. Nurses learned to work with steady hands, even as their hearts ached. Their task was not only to heal, but to comfort, to hold hands in final moments, to whisper reassurances that families were far away to give. Supplies were often limited. In field hospitals, equipment broke down, medicines ran short, and blood supplies thinned. Nurses improvised constantly, sterilizing instruments with makeshift methods, fashioning bandages from torn sheets, using whatever was available to keep patients alive. In villages, conditions were even harsher. Vietnamese nurses worked without electricity, using oil lamps for light. They treated wounds with herbal poultices when antibiotics were unavailable. Their work demanded creativity as much as skill. Night brought no rest. If anything, nights were heavier. Darkness magnified the uncertainty, and the groans of patients seemed louder when the world outside was still. Nurses moved from bed to bed, checking pulses, adjusting for drips, cooling fevers with damp cloths. Some nights passed quietly, with only a few patients in critical condition. Others were a blur of urgency, as convoys of wounded arrived in quick succession. The hours bled into one another, and the line between day and night blurred until time itself felt suspended. The sound of helicopters became a signal of dread. Each arrival meant more casualties, more blood, more pressure to act quickly. Nurses learned to anticipate the moment when the doors opened, revealing stretchers and faces pale with shock. They worked shoulder to shoulder with doctors, but often it was the nurses who maintained the rhythm of care, organizing supplies, preparing patients, offering words that steadied the chaos. The forgotten detail is the quiet moments in between. When the flurry of emergency care slowed, nurses often sat beside patients, reading letters aloud, writing messages for those unable to move their arms, or simply listening. In those small exchanges, humanity returned to places otherwise dominated by machines and wounds. For patients, the presence of a nurse was often the difference between despair and endurance. Vietnamese nurses, working closer to villages and in underground facilities, faced constant danger. Bombs could fall near their hospitals at any moment. Supplies were scarcer still, and the line between civilian and soldier blurred. They cared for fighters in hidden clinics, moving patients deeper underground when raids threatened. Their nights were filled not only with tending wounds, but with fear of discovery. Yet they continued because the need was greater than the risk for both American and Vietnamese nurses. The war was not an abstract struggle, but a daily confrontation with suffering. They bore witness to what others often avoided: the raw aftermath of battle, the toll on bodies and minds. Their memories were filled not with victories or defeats, but with faces, voices, the weight of hands they once held. And so the question rises: how does one endure nights filled with endless wounds, where each life saved is shadowed by another, lost, and where the work continues without pause, without recognition, without end? Asterisk, the figure of the nurse in the Vietnam War stands at a crossroads of history, between the battlefield and the home, between technology and improvisation, between the visible and the forgotten. To grasp their role is to move beyond the image of soldiers in combat and into the quieter but equally relentless spaces where survival was decided one patient at a time. For American nurses stationed in evacuation hospitals, days began with triage. The sound of helicopter blades announced the arrival of casualties long before the aircraft touched down. Nurses rushed to the landing zone, stretchers already waiting. Dust and debris swirled as medics shouted brief reports: shrapnel wound, chest, compound fracture, leg burns, 3rd degree. Within minutes, the wounded were carried inside, and the nurses' work began. Triage demanded not only skill, but composure. Nurses had to assess quickly who could be saved, who required immediate surgery, and who had little chance of survival. These decisions weighed heavily. Every choice meant directing scarce resources, blood, time, operating space toward some and not others. Nurses carried those choices long after the shifts ended, replaying them in memory, questioning whether another decision might have changed an outcome. Inside the wards, the rhythm of care unfolded in cycles of urgency and monotony. After emergency surgeries, patients needed constant monitoring. Nurses checked vital signs, adjusted for lines, cleaned wounds, and administered medicine. The air was heavy with disinfectant, but also with the lingering smell of blood and smoke, clinging to uniforms. Generators hummed in the background, sometimes faltering, leaving nurses to work in dim light until repairs were made. The emotional landscape was as demanding as the physical one. Young men cried out for their mothers, their voices trembling in the unfamiliar language of fear. Others whispered requests for letters to be sent, words to loved ones, in case they did not survive. Nurses became not only caregivers, but messengers, scribes, and companions, wiped brows, and offered comfort in moments when families were thousands of miles away. The work of Vietnamese nurses carried similar burdens, but often with even fewer resources. In makeshift clinics, hidden in forests or underground, they treated fighters and villagers with whatever materials were available. A broken limb might be splinted with bamboo. Hers were cooled with herbal poultices. Wounds were cleaned with boiled water when antiseptic ran out. The nights were long, lit by oil lamps that flickered against earthen walls. Nurses whispered encouragement to patients who knew they might not survive until morning. Fear was constant. For American nurses, fear came from the proximity of rocket attacks or mortar that could strike even bases considered safe. For Vietnamese nurses, fear meant discovery by enemy patrols, sudden bombings, or the collapse of hidden clinics under artillery fire. Yet, both groups continued, because stopping was never an option. To cease meant abandoning those who needed care, and that was unthinkable. The bonds formed between nurses and patients were profound, though often brief. A nurse might sit with a patient through the long hours of night, only to lose him by dawn. Another might witness miraculous recoveries, watching as someone once at death's edge walked again weeks later. Each outcome left its mark. Nurses learned to balance hope with realism, to celebrate small victories while preparing themselves for inevitable losses. Letters from home, when they arrived, provided small moments of reprieve. Nurses read news from families, photographs tucked into envelopes, reminders of lives far removed from the war. Some shared these letters with patients, reading aloud to lift spirits. Yet even these comforts were bittersweet, for they highlighted the distance between the world of war and the world of home, a distance that sometimes felt impossible to cross. Exhaustion defined much of the nurse's existence. Shifts blurred into one another, meals were skipped, and rest was always secondary to duty. Many learned to function on a few hours of sleep, trained their bodies to ignore hunger, and push through fevers or illness. The work demanded a kind of endurance that left lasting scars. Long after the war, many nurses spoke of chronic fatigue, of memories that woke them at night, of the weight they carried silently for decades. Yet in the moment, their focus was on the next patient, the next wound, the next chance to preserve life. Their work was not glamorous, and it rarely appeared in official reports. But without their presence, survival rates would have plummeted. Every stitch, every bandage, every whispered reassurance represented an act of resistance against despair. And so we must ask, if wars are remembered for battles and leaders, what does it mean that the quiet labor of nurses, their long nights, their unseen sacrifices, fades so easily from memory? Asterisk by the closing years of the Vietnam War. Nurses, American and Vietnamese alike, had carried burdens that no medal or official recognition could truly measure. Their nights of care, filled with exhaustion and heartbreak, left invisible scars. Yet their work continued, sustained not by glory, but by the simple knowledge that without them, countless more would have been lost. In American field hospitals, the scale of casualties grew with each major offensive. During the Tet Offensive of 1968, helicopters landed in waves, unloading stretchers faster than staff could process them. Nurses moved through the chaos with quiet efficiency, cleaning wounds, starting IVs, assisting in surgeries that stretched through the night. Some worked 36 hours without rest, their hands steady, even as their minds blurred with fatigue. To stop was unthinkable. The wounded kept coming. Vietnamese nurses faced parallel challenges in rural clinics and underground facilities. When bombing raids struck nearby, they moved patients deeper into tunnels, sometimes carrying stretchers on their backs through narrow passages. They listened to the thunder above while pressing cloth to wounds below, determined to preserve life, even as death rained down from the sky. Many treated both villagers and fighters, their work blurring the line between civilian and combatant. For them, the war was not political need. was simply an endless stream of suffering bodies that needed care. The emotional toll of this work was immense. Nurses held the hands of dying soldiers who whispered names of loved ones they would never see again. They cradled children whose burns marked them as victims of a conflict they did not understand. They comforted villagers who had lost entire families. Each life saved was a victory. Each life lost was a memory that lingered long after the war ended. Yet amid the grief were moments of quiet triumph. A patient once believed too far gone who opened his eyes after days of fever. A man with shattered legs who stood again after months of recovery. A child who learned to smile despite scars. These moments sustained the nurses, offering proof that their long nights mattered. They reminded them that even in war, healing was possible. When the war ended in 1975, many nurses returned to lives that seemed unrecognizable. American nurses came home to a country divided, where veterans were often met with silence rather than gratitude. Their stories rarely appeared in newspapers, and their contributions were overshadowed by political debates. Some carried their memories quietly, working in hospitals but unable to forget the faces they attended in Vietnam. Others spoke later, sharing testimonies that revealed the depth of their experiences. Vietnamese nurses returned to villages scarred by bombing and loss. Many continued to work in local clinics, treating wounds that lingered long after the fighting stopped: malnutrition, disease, and the effects of chemical exposure. Their nights remained long, though the rhythm shifted from war to recovery. They carried on with little recognition, their names absent from official histories. Their contributions remembered only by those they had saved. Today, memorials to the Vietnam War exist in both America and Vietnam. Walls of names, statues of soldiers, museums filled with photographs. Yet rarely do these memorials center the nurses, if their role survives mostly in personal stories, in letters, in memories passed quietly among families. They are the forgotten caretakers, the ones whose labor was essential, yet invisible. The story of the nurses is a reminder that war is not only about destruction, it is also about the struggle to preserve life amid destruction. It is about hands that stitched wounds, voices that whispered comfort, and bodies that endured sleepless nights for the sake of others. Their work was not heroic in the traditional sense, but it was indispensable. And so, the final reflection lingers. If history overlooks the nurses who labored through the long nights of war, what else do we fail to remember about the quiet, unseen work that sustains humanity in its darkest hours? Asterisk by the closing years of the Vietnam War, racism, American and Vietnamese alike had carried burdens that no medal or official recognition could truly measure. Their nights of care, filled with exhaustion and heartbreak, left invisible scars. Yet their work continued, sustained not by glory, but by the simple knowledge that without them, countless more would have been lost. In American field hospitals, the scale of casualties grew with each major offensive. During the Tet Offensive of 1968, helicopters landed in waves, unloading stretchers faster than staff could process them. Nurses moved through the chaos with quiet efficiency, cleaning wounds, starting IVs, assisting in surgeries that stretched through the night. Some worked 36 hours without rest, their hands steady, even as their minds blurred with fatigue. To stop was unthinkable. The wounded kept coming. Vietnamese nurses faced parallel challenges in rural clinics and underground facilities. When bombing raids struck nearby, they moved patients deeper into tunnels, sometimes carrying stretchers on their backs through narrow passages. They listened to the thunder above while pressing cloth 2 wounds below, determined to preserve life, even as death rained down from the sky. Many treated both villagers and fighters, their work blurring the line between civilian and combatant. For them, the war was not political need. was simply an endless stream of suffering bodies that needed care. The emotional toll of this work was immense. Nurses held the hands of dying soldiers who whispered names of loved ones they would never see again. They cradled children whose burns marked them as victims of a conflict they did not understand. They comforted villagers who had lost entire families. Each life saved was a victory. Each life lost was a memory that lingered long after the war ended. Yet amid the grief were moments of quiet triumph. A patient once believed too far gone who opened his eyes after days of fever. A man with shattered legs who stood again after months of recovery. A child who learned to smile despite scars. These moments sustained the nurses, offering proof that their long nights mattered. They reminded them that even in war, healing was possible. When the war ended in 1975, many nurses returned to lives that seemed unrecognizable. American nurses came home to a country divided, where veterans were often met with silence rather than gratitude. Vietnamese nurses returned to villages scarred by bombing and loss. Many continued to work in local clinics, treating wounds that lingered long after the fighting stopped. Malnutrition, disease, and the effects of chemical exposure. Their nights remained long, though the rhythm shifted from war to recovery. They carried on with little recognition, their names absent from official histories. Their contributions remembered only by those they had saved. Today, memorials to the Vietnam War exist in both America and Vietnam. Walls of names, statues of soldiers, museums filled with photographs. Yet rarely do these memorials center the nurses. Their role survives mostly in personal stories, in letters, in memories passed quietly among families. They are the forgotten caretakers, the ones whose labor was essential yet invisible. The story of the nurses is a reminder that war is not only about destruction, it is also about the struggle to preserve life amid destruction. It is about hands that stitched wounds, voices that whispered comfort, and bodies that endured sleepless nights for the sake of others. Their work was not heroic in the traditional sense, but it was indispensable. And so, the final reflection lingers. If history overlooks the nurses who labored through the long nights of war, what else do we fail to remember about the quiet, unseen work that sustains humanity in its darkest hours? Long before the roar of helicopters filled the skies of Vietnam, the war moved along its roads. These roads were not grand highways, but narrow, uneven ribbons of dirt and gravel, cut through jungles and villages, carrying convoys of trucks and jeeps that became lifelines for armies and communities alike. To trace these dusty roads is to understand a quieter, slower rhythm of the Vietnam War, one where battles were measured, not in explosions, but in the grinding of gears, the rattle of cargo, and the endless patience of those who drove and repaired the vehicles. The roads themselves were fragile. In the dry season, they turned into rivers of dust. Trucks rolled forward under a haze that coated leaves, houses, and skin alike. Drivers wore scarves over their mouths, their eyes narrowed against the powder that filled every crease of clothing and every joint of machinery. By day's end, vehicles and men were indistinguishable from the earth, their bodies painted in shades of red and brown. In the monsoon season, the same roads became rivers of mud. Tires sank deep, wheels spun uselessly, and trucks stalled mid-route. Drivers and soldiers dismounted to push, straining with ropes and planks to free vehicles that lurched and groaned. Progress slowed to a crawl, sometimes only a few kilometers. In a day, convoys were stranded for hours, even days, while rains fell endlessly. The road was no longer path but obstacle, demanding as much labor as the journey itself. Convoys were not glamorous. They were slow, exposed, and vulnerable. Each carried supplies, fuel, ammunition, food, medical equipment that determined whether bases could hold and whether soldiers could fight. Drivers knew the risk. Roads were frequent targets for ambushes, landmines, and airstrikes. Sit. Behind the wheel was the balance between duty and danger. Eyes fixed ahead, while ears strained for every unfamiliar sound. But even when no attack came, the monotony itself was punishing. Hours of slow travel under oppressive heat wore down both men and machines. Engines overheated, tires shredded on rough terrain, axles broke under the strain of overloaded cargo. Mechanics traveled with convoys, their hands blackened with grease, ready to repair vehicles on the roadside. Sometimes repairs took place under fire, the clang of tools competing with the crack of rifles. Every successful restart of an engine was a small victory. Every mile gained a measure of endurance. The people along the roads lived in constant interaction with the convoys. Villagers watched as lines of trucks crawled past, raising clouds that settled on roofs and rice fields. Children waved, sometimes running alongside until dust choked them. Market stalls adjusted to the rhythms of convoys, offering food or water where trucks paused. Yet villages also bore the burden of these roads. Bombing raids targeted supply lines, and when trucks stopped near settlements, danger followed. The dusty road was both artery and wound, feeding armies while exposing civilians to violence. At night, convoys often continued, headlights dimmed or blacked out to avoid detection. Drivers navigated by memory, by the faint glow of stars, or by the outline of the road against darker fields. Silence pressed heavy, broken only by the steady hum of engines and the crunch of gravel. Men leaned forward in their seats, straining to keep the convoy together, knowing that a single breakdown could halt dozens of vehicles. Night travel was slower, but sometimes safer. Hidden under the cloak of darkness, the convoys also revealed the war's reliance on the ordinary. There was no grandeur in sitting for hours on a hot bench seat, steering through dust and mud. There was no drama in waiting while mechanics patched a radiator or while rains drained away. Yet, without these efforts, the machinery of war stalled. The convoys carried the boring but essential weight of survival. One slow kilometer after another, one overlooked detail was the patience required. Drivers often spent entire days moving a distance that in peacetime might take an hour. They learned to accept delays, breakdowns, and detours as normal. Conversations with fellow drivers filled the time. Voices shouted over engines or shared during repair stops. They spoke of families, of food, of the endless dust that seemed to seep into bones. Laughter sometimes broke the monotony, but silence often returned, the road demanding attention. The dusty roads became a metaphor for the war itself, slow, grueling, filled with obstacles, and sustained by persistence more than by glory. Each convoy represented endurance, not triumph. Each mile traveled was proof that survival required not only battles fought, but burdens carried. And so the question lingers when we remember the Vietnam War. Do we think of the slow crawl of dusty convoys, the drivers who endured monotony and danger in equal measure, and the roads that bore the weight of a war too heavy for their fragile surfaces? Asterisk, the life of a convoy driver in Vietnam was shaped by a paradox. The work was monotonous, yet the danger was constant. Each day meant long hours behind the wheel, crawling forward through heat and dust, yet every turn of the road might conceal a mine, an ambush, or an airstrike. To endure this was to live in a state of constant tension, where the ordinary and the perilous were inseparable. Convoys often began before dawn. Drivers rose in the darkness, rubbing dust from their eyes, pulling on uniforms stiff with sweat and dirt. Engines coughed awake, filling the air with exhaust. The first minutes of the day carried an anxious energy, vehicles lining up loads. Secured, weapons checked, orders repeated. Then, slowly, the line began to move, one truck after another, like a great steel serpent winding into the jungle or across open plains. The pace was slow, dictated by the weakest vehicle in the line. Breakdowns were inevitable. A tire burst, an axle snapped, or a radiator boiled over, and the entire convoy halted. Mechanics scrambled to work, their tools clanging as dust clung to grease. Drivers stood nearby, smoking or wiping sweat, waiting for the signal to move again. Hours were lost this way, one small failure multiplying into long delays. Patience was as essential as fuel. Dust defined the dry season. It coated windshields until drivers could barely see ahead. It seeped into engines, grinding down machinery. It clung to faces, turning every man the same dull red. Soldiers joked that dust was the true uniform of the convoy. At the end of the day, men wiped layers of powder from their arms and necks, coughing from lungs lined with grit. Yet there was no escape. Dust was the cost of progress. When rains arrived, the landscape transformed. Roads turned into bogs, trucks sank to their axles, and convoys became immobile. Drivers waded into mud to lay planks or cut branches for traction. Chains were looped around wheels, ropes tied to vehicles ahead. Progress slowed to a crawl, each meter gained through sweat and strain. The monsoon rains fell endlessly, drumming on roofs, filling potholes, and soaking clothing until skin blistered. Drivers shivered in wet uniforms, the damp never leaving. Even in sleep, the threat of ambush haunted every convoy. The sides of the road, thick with jungle, concealed danger. Guerrilla fighters planted mines or timed attacks when convoys were most vulnerably. Steep inclines, at river crossings, or during breakdowns. Drivers watched the road with sharp eyes, searching for disturbed earth or unusual patterns that might signal a trap. Yet, even vigilance could not prevent sudden explosions. A single mine could rip through a truck, scattering debris and halting the line. In those moments, dust turned to smoke and silence turned to chaos. Airstrikes posed another challenge. Bombers targeted supply routes relentlessly, leaving behind craters that swallowed trucks whole. Bridges were destroyed, forcing detours across makeshift crossings. Drivers grew accustomed to the sight of burned-out vehicles along the roadside, silent reminders of convoys that had not made it through. Still, they pressed forward, because to stop was to abandon the supplies that sustained entire units. The human side of convoy life is often overlooked. Drivers formed close bonds, forged in shared monotony and danger. They learned each other's habits, knew who could fix an engine fastest, who carried extra cigarettes, who could keep spirits up with a joke. Long hours in line, loud conversations shouted across windows or shared during halts. They spoke of home, of families, of food long missed. In these exchanges, they found small relief from the grind of the road. Villagers along the routes also lived with the presence of convoys. Some sold food or water when trucks stopped. Others simply watched as dust covered their homes and fields. For them, the road was both lifeline and curse. It brought supplies that sustained armies, but also drew violence as bombings and ambushes targeted the convoys. Children waved as trucks passed, unaware of the dangers that lurked just beyond the roadside. Convoys carried more than military cargo. They carried mail, medical supplies, and even comforts from home. Single truck might hold sacks of rice, crates of ammunition, barrels of fuel, and a small bag of letters, all equally essential in their own ways. For the soldiers waiting at distant bases, the arrival of a convoy meant survival. It meant food to eat, weapons to fight, medicine to heal, and words from home to sustain morale. Mechanics remained unsung heroes. Without them, convoys would have disintegrated within days. They patched holes, replaced tires, welded frames, and coaxed life from engines on the verge of failure. Their work was constant, their hands perpetually stained with oil. In the dust and rain, with limited tools, they kept the wheels turning. Each repair, however small, was another step forward. The dusty roads became a world unto themselves, with their own rhythms, dangers, and rituals. Drivers began to measure time, not in days, but in convoys completed, in kilometers crawled, in breakdowns endured. The road became their universe, stretching endlessly ahead, demanding patience and persistence. And so, we might ask, when history speaks of battles won and lost, do we forget that those battles depended on convoys inching forward through dust and mud, their progress slow, their labor invisible, but their impact immeasurable? Asterisk, by the war's later years, the dusty roads of Vietnam had become scarred, arteries choked with craters, crowded with convoys, and remembered in silence by those who endured them. They were not places of strategy or speeches, but of constant motion, where the war advanced in slow, grinding kilometers, carried on the backs of trucks, jeeps, and the patience of men who drove them. For many drivers, memory of the road was inseparable from memory of the war itself. They did not speak of battles, but of dust so thick it coated the tongue. They recalled the endless rumble of engines, the squeal of brakes on steep inclines, the sweat dripping into eyes as they steered through haze. They remembered the smell of diesel, the heat of metal dashboards under the sun, the weight of hours spent gripping the wheel until hands cramped. The road was not dramatic, but it was relentless, and in its relentlessness lay its power. Convoy travel demanded a strange mixture of monotony and vigilance. Hours might pass in quiet crawling, dust rising in lazy clouds, only to be broken by sudden bursts of terror mine detonating beneath the lead truck, gunfire from the jungle, a crater yawning across the path. Drivers lived in the tension between boredom and fear, never fully safe, never fully at rest. Each trip carried the possibility that it might be the last dot when accidents or ambushes struck. The convoy became a community of survival. Drivers leaped from cabs to help wounded comrades. Mechanics rushed forward to pull parts from damaged trucks. Soldiers formed defensive lines along the road. Dust turned to smoke, silence to shouts, yet the convoy endured. Sometimes vehicles had to be abandoned, their cargo redistributed among the rest. The road never stopped demanding, never stopped swallowing time and labor. The convoys also carried stories beyond the military. Villagers who lived along the roads often interacted with drivers. Some provided food and water, grateful for trade. Others watched with wary eyes, knowing that the presence of convoys brought danger. Bombs targeted the roads, and when convoys passed, villages sometimes paid the price. Dust settled on thatched roofs and rice fields, while the rumble of engines shook walls. For many civilians, the memory of the war is tied not to battlefields, but to the sight of trucks crawling endlessly by. Night convoys created a different atmosphere. Headlights dimmed, engines muted, trucks crept forward under the cover of darkness. Drivers leaned close to windshields, straining to see the faint outlines of the road. The night air was cooler, but it carried its own dangers. Visibility was limited, paths uncertain, and fear sharper. Still, night offered protection from bombers, and so the convoys moved. Their progress measured by the rhythm of engines in the dark. The maintenance of the roads themselves became a task as essential as the convoys. Engineers and laborers repaired craters, rebuilt bridges, and laid new tracks through forests. Their work was ceaseless, for destruction came as quickly as repairs. The war was as much a struggle of endurance between repair and ruin as it was of combat. Without these workers, the convoys would have halted. Without the convoys, armies would have starved. When the war ended in 1975, the roads bore scars that outlasted the conflict. Craters remained as ponds, bridges sagged with damage, and abandoned vehicles rusted along paths reclaimed by jungle. For drivers who survived, the memory of those roads lingered long after. Some returned to civilian driving, but highways in peacetime could never erase the endless crawl of convoys under fire. Others left driving behind entirely, unwilling to revisit the monotony and fear of those years. Today, remnants of those roads still exist, though nature has reclaimed much. Grass grows where dust once choked, trees arch over paths once cut by convoys, and villagers plant rice where bomb craters once split the earth. Yet the memory of the dusty roads remains in stories told quietly by former drivers, by mechanics, by families who lived along the routes. They speak of patience, of endurance, of lives measured not in battles, but in kilometers. The story of the convoys reminds us that wars are not sustained only by battles. They are sustained by the slow, invisible labor of moving supplies, of keeping roads open, of enduring monotony and danger in equal measure. The dusty roads of Vietnam were not places of glory, but they were places where the war was carried forward, meter by meter, wheel by wheel. And so the reflection lingers when history remembers wars through dramatic victories or defeats. Do we forget the dusty roads, the convoys that crawled upon them, and the men and women whose lives were spent in the endless patience of simply keeping the war moving? Asterisk, when we think of the Vietnam War, we often picture soldiers in uniform, helicopters, hovering above jungles, or convoys pushing through dust. Yet millions of children lived through those same years, their days and nights shaped by the sound of bombers overhead and the uncertainty of survival. To understand the war fully, one must step into their world. The ordinary routines of childhood lived beneath extraordinary terror. In villages scattered across the countryside, childhood unfolded not in playgrounds or classrooms, but in rice paddies, makeshift shelters, and crowded bunkers. For many, school was interrupted or destroyed. Lessons, when possible, were held in borrowed homes or under trees, chalkboards propped against walls. Children wrote their characters on slates with chalk, ears tuned not only to their teachers, but to the distant hum of engines in the sky. Learning itself became fragile, constantly at the mercy of sirens and raids. The sound of aircraft was a constant presence. Children learned to distinguish between types of planes, the steady drone of transport aircraft, the sharper whine of fighter jets, the deep thunder of bombers. To an outsider, these might blur together, but to a child, the differences meant everything. A certain pitch meant danger, another meant temporary safety. Games were often interrupted as children stopped to listen, scanning the skies with a seriousness far beyond their years. When bombs fell, life collapsed into chaos. Families rushed. 2 bunkers dug beneath their homes, earthen shelters reinforced with bamboo and logs. Some villages built communal shelters where dozens huddled together in the dark, waiting for explosions to pass. Children crouched in silence, clutching the hands of parents, their small bodies trembling with fear. The ground shook, dust fell from ceilings, and the air filled with a roar of destruction. When silence finally returned, the children emerged into landscapes, transformed fields, cratered, homes splintered, familiar paths buried under debris. For many, these raids became part of the rhythm of life. Fear turned into routine. Children learned where to run, how to hide, when to stay still. They played games imitating bomb shelters, digging small holes in the earth and pretending to hide. Inside, the line between play and survival blurred. As imagination adapted to the realities of war, daily life continued despite the danger. Children fetched water from streams, carried bundles of firewood, and helped tend to rice fields alongside parents. They cared for younger siblings while adults worked or fought. Their chores were ordinary, yet the backdrop was extraordinary always, under the shadow of possible attack. The hum of an approaching aircraft could turn an ordinary afternoon into a scramble for survival. Malnutrition shaped many childhoods. Bombings disrupted agriculture, and food was often scarce. Meals were small bowls of rice stretched with vegetables, sometimes supplemented with cassava or wild greens. Children grew thin, their ribs visible beneath skin. Hunger became as familiar as fear, yet they found ways to adapt, foraging in forests, fishing in rivers, or trading with neighbors. The struggle for food was constant, but so was the instinct to survive. Play, though limited, still found a place. Children chased one another along dikes, flew kites fashioned from scraps of paper, or carved toys from wood. Laughter still echoed, even in villages scarred by bombing. These moments of joy were fragile but essential, reminders that even under war, the human spirit sought light. For parents, the sound of children's laughter was both comfort and pain. Comfort that innocence persisted, pain that it might not last. Some children lost families to raids, becoming orphans overnight. They were taken in by relatives, neighbors, or sometimes left to fend for themselves. The bonds of community became crucial. Villages shared responsibility for raising children, pooling food and shelter. Childhood, in this sense, was collective. Survival depended on the willingness of communities to care for the young, even when resources were scarce. For children in cities, the experience was no less harsh. Urban areas like Hanoi or Saigon were frequent targets, as families built bunkers beneath homes or used basements as shelters. Sirens wailed, streets emptied, and children clutched dolls or toys as they hurried underground. After raids, they returned to streets littered with debris, shops shuttered, and buildings scarred by fire. City life offered no escape from fear. It simply offered different shelters, and so one must pause and ask, what does it mean to grow up in a world where games are interrupted by sirens, where schools are silenced by bombs, and where childhood itself is measured not by birthdays, but by raids survived? Asterisk, the childhoods lived beneath bombing raids were shaped by constant adaptation. To survive meant learning early and learning quickly. Children developed instincts that in other times belonged only to adults. They could recognize the distant pitch of engines, calculate the time between sirens and explosions, and memorize the safest paths to shelters. These skills were not taught in schools. They were learned by repetition, etched into memory by necessity. Parents tried to shield their children from fear, but the war made such protection impossible. Instead, they passed down small rituals of survival. Mothers kept bundles of food and water near shelters, teaching children how to carry them in haste. Fathers dug bunkers deeper, showing children how to reinforce walls with logs or bamboo. Grandparents whispered prayers, calling on ancestors for protection. These rituals became part of daily life, as ordinary as cooking meals or fetching water. Schools, when they existed, adapted to the rhythm of raids. Teachers instructed students to scatter at the first sound of danger, to carry slates and books with them to shelters. Lessons were interrupted again and again, but they continued, sometimes underground, sometimes in open fields after buildings were destroyed. Children sat cross-legged in the dirt, writing with chalk, listening as much for aircraft as for arithmetic. Knowledge advanced slowly, but persistence itself became a form of defiance. Bombing left physical scars not only on landscapes, but on bodies. Children who survived explosions often bore injuries for life burns, shrapnel wounds, or hearing loss from the thunder of blasts. Hospitals overflowed, and medical supplies were scarce. Nurses and doctors improvised treatments, but for many,